Thanks. Great. So yes, I have Licy here from APCO, and I'm Catherine Zaleski, board chair at Power to Fly and co-founder of the company. And you all, I hope, are ready for some major wisdom today, because we're capping off the summit this afternoon with three people who always come back by popular demand. So Licy, my dear friend and Power to Fly advisor, who, when not helping Power to Fly with his infinite wisdom, is the managing director for the Washington, D.C. office of APCO Worldwide. And I'll just jump in and say a quick anecdote about Licy. 3 years ago, around this time, we did our first Diversity Reboot Summit. And I called up Licy and I said, I need help. And he said, how can I open up my Rolodex and make it happen? And he had Dr. Rockeymoore Cummings come on. We had Charlene Wheeless come on later, but it's just amazing that we're 3 years into this now, and we still get to have these esteemed groups that you're going to see today talk to all of us. So we're in for a real treat. Licy is going to be leading this panel with Dr. Rockeymoore Cummings, who I said was at our first summit, CEO of Global Policy Solutions, and Charlene Wheeless, who is APCO's Senior Advisor for Equity and Justice. So this group is all about sharing their experiences and what they know the future ought to be. So listen closely, ask questions, because Licy is taking questions through the chat box. And I'm going to kick it over to the panel now so we can get things started. Thank you all again for being here. Very appreciated.
Catherine, thank you for that gracious, kind introduction of all of us. Wow. Charlene and Maya together for the first time at Power to Fly. You've heard from both of them in our previous conversations that I've done one-on-one, and we all thought it was time that we brought together all of us for this conversation. This is today's kitchen conversation with Dr. Maya Cummings Rockeymoore and Charlene Wheeless about the journey is continuing, but how far have we gotten? What have we learned along the way? And what does it mean for racial equity in 2023? So Maya, Charlene, thanks so much. Let's dive right in. We're going to take questions along the way, and I know there will be about a lot. Before we get into an array of topics that I want to get into with both of you today, I want to start really at the beginning. And Maya, I want to start with you. Tell us a little bit about your upbringing, and importantly, how it has shaped your view on what we're talking about today, equity and race and racial equity.
So thank you so much, Licy, for having me. Thanks to Power to Fly. Good to see you, Charlene. I'm looking forward to this conversation. I am the fourth generation from slavery in this country. And I usually start my talks by this because people need to hear that we all come from different historical backgrounds, but we're now all here in this place and space called the United States of America. And so I'm the fourth generation from slavery. Both of my parents were from Texas. They grew up in the Jim Crow South. I grew up listening to them tell stories about what it was like to live in segregated America. Their entire K through 12 educational experience was actually in separate and unequal schools, where they could only attend schools with all Black children. And so, you know, we grew up listening to these stories, but our lives, my sister, brother, and I, our lives are very, very different. I am the first generation, me, my sister, and brother, we are the first generation in our family to attend integrated schools through our entire K through 12 experience. So that is because my father went into the US military, the Air Force, in the late 1960s during the Vietnam era. And we ended up moving all across the country and living and representing the United States abroad as well as an Air Force family. And that meant that I lived next door to white kids or kids who had Asian American heritage or Latino heritage. Literally, military bases and installations are a United Nation, a hodgepodge, if you will, of diversity. And since the 1940s, that has been fully integrated. And so with that, you know, my primary question in life has been, you know, if I could grow up and if military people and families can live in harmony on military bases, next door to each other, loving each other, being friends with each other, attending school with each other, thriving together on military installations across the country. Why can't the rest of America do that?
Charlene, why can't the rest of America do that? Let's start with your background and how it's shaped your worldview as a Black woman.
Sure, of course. So I originally hail from East Oakland. And quite frankly, I was born into the ghetto of Oakland, California in 1964, which was a very different environment. And it was quite interesting for me because I did not grow up initially in an integrated background in any way. I'm the first one. I have 3 older brothers, but with my brothers and my parents, I am the first one to graduate from high school in my family. I'm the first one to go to college in my family and to actually work in a professional job. And, it's been an interesting experience for me because up until a few years ago, my entire career has been in corporate. And as I like to say, I grew up in corporate trying to build a career in companies and environments that were not built for me. And throughout my career, I have always been the only Black woman at my level or the first and only executive Black woman at a company. And that didn't really matter whether the company was 50 years old or 150 years old. So I always say that, I really cut my chops as being an only. And for many of you who are out there, you recognize both the honor and the burden that exists with being an only, because your success is everybody's success, but your failure is the failure of everyone who looks like you. So it's been quite a learning experience for me. I ultimately, when I left corporate in 2020 following an illness, I decided to write a book to talk about what it's really like having to prove that you are enough when you're constantly being told that you aren't. And so I wrote a book about that really took my very true lessons and turned those into strategies for other people. I now live and see how people from different backgrounds can live in harmony. It's been a very, very interesting couple of years for me. My family is an interracial family. So my husband is white and I have biracial children. And over the last 3 years, especially, all of us have really learned a lot about living and working together and understanding each other's experiences in a way that we had not before. I think my husband has learned a lot about what it's like to have a Black wife and biracial children, because as a family, we forget that we're interracial until someone reminds us. But over the last 3 years, we were constantly reminded. And also having my daughters who have both graduated from college and are in the professional world, having to face questions of what are you? Not who are you or what are you about, but what are you? And what was it like for them being biracial at a time when, 5 years ago, we thought we were making so much progress. And over the last 3 years, it really has felt like we've been taking steps backward. So I say my experience has very much been informed by my lived experience.
Listening to both of you, I think about how we all have grown up in very similar circumstances and have found a way to navigate all of these challenges and opportunities. And that in 2023, so much of that still is happening for many. We have made many advances for sure, but I still remember, Charlene, like you have just said, being asked not who are you, but what are you? Growing up in the early 70s in inner city Boston at a time where it was great civil unrest and racial issues there has gotten, I think, a lot better since, but there's still some of that underlying aspect there. And being asked, like, what are you, right? My parents being from West Africa and, and speaking another language, and certainly my name confused a lot of people. And to this day, hearing and knowing that you're being asked, people are being asked who are biracial, multiracial, what are you? Tells us just how far we still need to go in our society. I want to turn just for a moment now on to some of the issues that we're grappling with in our society, and get your thoughts on these. Maya, President Biden at his State of the Union address gave an emotional plea for police reform, denouncing at that time, as I think we all remember, Tyree Nichols' senseless and tragic murder. His parents were in the gallery, and as you may have caught, as I did, as the president was speaking about police reform, Tyree's mother whispered her mouth, do something. What do you, Maya, think is gonna take to remove violence and brutality from policing in this country? And is it going to take a reform coming through government, or is it going to be something more radical, as some have suggested? What do you think?
I think it's going to be all the above. The fact of the matter is that we have more than 2,000 separate policing units throughout the United States of America at the federal, state, and local levels. That's a huge number of policing units that have no overarching regulatory structure, that have no standards for the entire country. And as a result, what you get are basically a hodgepodge of hiring, approaches, a hodgepodge of training approaches, a hodgepodge of behaviors. And as a result, what we have is what we have, which is unfortunately in too many places around the country, a totally unworkable and certainly lethal and dangerous situation. Where African-American men, Latino men and women, cannot walk down the streets unmolested some places without, policing entities and officers thinking that they're somehow criminal and subject to abuse just because of the color of their skin. We have reached a point in this country where we understand that we are all human beings. There is no one that is higher, there is no one that is lesser. And yet we have a policing structure in this country that still perpetuates the notion that if you're Black or brown, you are an automatic threat to society. And then we see it constantly reflected in these basically unacceptable police brutality and officer inflicted basically deaths across the country that are totally unwarranted. And so, yes, what needs to happen is that we need to have comprehensive legislative reform. There needs to be a structure, guardrails around those 2,000 plus entities in this country. And guess what? If they don't want to comply with legislative guardrails that are set at the federal level, guess what the feds can do to hold them accountable? They can withhold federal monies from these local and state policing entities if they are not in compliance. The federal government has the power of the purse in order to basically ensure that these entities are following guidelines. Those guidelines need to be strict. They need to cover what police can do on street corners. They need to cover, training issues. I don't know if you know, but we have a problem in places around the country where far right-wing ultra-nationalist entities are actually basically infiltrating police units. And they've got police officers who belong to them and some who are sympathetic to them. And so with that, we cannot accept that in this year of 2023. We have work to do. We have work to do on culture. We have work to do on legislation, and we certainly have work to do on budgeting and holding people accountable with the power of the purse.
Charlene, you and I, and we all have many friends who are police officers who are in law enforcement. I talk with my friends who are police chiefs around the country. The police have a very difficult job, and it's an important role that they play, to be sure. However, when I look at the data in the databases that track police shootings, we continue to see at least over the last 5 or 6 years, that disproportionately Black Americans are killed at a much higher rate than others. Maya talked about the culture here, the culture in trying to understand what's happening. What do you think needs to be done when we take a look at race, equity, culture as it relates to police reform?
Well, I think we absolutely have to look at what's going on in the culture of police departments and police organizations and law enforcement. You know, I certainly agree with Maya about having the right guardrails and policies and legislation, but I don't think that you can necessarily legislate behavior. And if we take just the Tyree Nichols as an example, I was astounded to learn that so many of those officers were Black, because I couldn't help but understand, to try to understand, and I could never get there, where was the role of humanity, right? Just where was the humanity? And so I really think that we have to look at the culture of the police departments and the culture of law enforcement, and what are we reinforcing? What are we rewarding? You know, it's not going to be a simple solution, but quite frankly, there are people who are in law enforcement who should not be there, period. They have biases that they bring to the table, and they're given the tools to be able to use those for bad rather than good. And I'm not saying that all police officers are bad. It is very hard to be a police officer today. I understand that. But there is no room for the kind of bias that causes us, quite frankly, to turn on our own people. I just can't understand that. And I think that the police officers, I think those who are running the police forces, I think they have to pay as much attention to the culture that they're building and the culture that they are reinforcing as they are the laws that are being put in place and the policies and the legislation. Because at the end of the day, it comes down to behavior. What do you do when no one else is watching? Are you doing the right thing? And if the answer is no, there's no room for you in law enforcement. You know, I grew up with 3 brothers who were very, very afraid of the police in a way that I never had to be. As I got older, I was not equally, but I was certainly afraid. But they spent their entire lives running from the police, not because of anything they did, but because of the color of their skin. And their view was, and I think about this when I thought about the Tyree Nichols situation and his murder, for them, the result was going to be the same. So are you going to take it, or are you going to run and try to save your life? And if those are your only 2 choices, we have some really big problems in our society.
Maya, speaking about choice, as I turn the conversation to what I would describe education and equity and potentially what you can call, or actually you can call, censorship. We just came out of Black History Month, and we all know that that Black history is American history. It's all of our histories, along with so many other. We are seeing lawmakers across the country, and some right here in Washington, D.C., who are looking at prohibitions on education with respect to critical aspects of our nation's history. And we see this happening in the efforts to remove iconic Black books from libraries. We also see it in what we are seeing in terms of dialing back the College Board's curriculum for advanced placement, African American studies. On this panel, as we talk about equity and race, and now we're talking about education, what are the obvious implications for restricting, if you will, what our country and our teachers are teaching our young people?
So you should know historically that we have been through this period before in our country. It was called the first Reconstruction. You know, after slavery, there was a period of Reconstruction where there were opportunities for newly, quote quote unquote freed people of color, African Americans who, became legislators, they became business owners, they became voters in places across the country, including the South. But then there was a backlash from ultra-conservative elements in our society who decided that they did not want Negroes, which is what they were called at the time, to become too quote unquote uppity. And so then began a process of repression. That repression started with taking away, assets and benefits, including the right to vote, including the right to represent your community in legislative assemblies, including educational opportunities. One by one, what they did was they restricted education, they restricted all of these various quote unquote benefits that were extended to people who had been held as slaves. And so what we have now is what they are calling politically the second Reconstruction. We had the Civil Rights Movement, which pushed to eradicate Jim Crow in the 1960s. It was largely successful. And as a result of that, we got unprecedented new opportunities, including affirmative action policies that allowed both African Americans, people of color generally, and by the way, women, including white women, entry to colleges and universities across this country, as well as opportunities in business and opportunities in corporate America, which Charlene was talking about. And so now what we're seeing is after George Floyd, there was a push to continue along this line of uplifting diversity, equity, and inclusion. And now we're seeing a huge backlash. And by the way, that backlash started, I think, in 2016. And it continued through the 4 years after 2016. And we continue to see ultra-conservative elements in our country, particularly leading edge politicians who are saying that we should not have education on African-American history. We should ban diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts like they've done in Texas recently. Mm-hmm. And I keep asking, what are you afraid of? Yes, we know that this is a playbook historically where you seek to repress communities because you want to go back to a time where whites only are in control of this society. But they're afraid of their children, I think, ultimately learning about what they did historically to people of color and their children turning on them and hating them for that. The fact of the matter is that we deserve better. We should not let this era in our history go down without a challenge.
Absolutely.
I want to encourage all of you listening to throw your questions into the chat. We are looking forward to responding to as many as we possibly can. Charlene, the challenge, of course, is what are we instructing our young people in this country? And many of the arguments have been that is who is in control of these institutions, whether on the left or the right. There are arguments from all sides. I'm curious what you think when you heard the attempts to restrict and decide what is history, what's not history, and the arguments that some have made that perhaps we're going too far in what we're teaching and we're teaching our young children. What do you make of that?
Well, to be less scientific about it, I think it's a load of crap, to be quite honest with you. But, I'm going to use the words of Ben Crump. I recently had the pleasure of attending the NAACP Image Awards, and Ben Crump received the Social Justice Impact Award. And in his acceptance speech, he said a few things, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he acknowledged that there's an effort to ban our most celebrated Black authors and African Americans in our studies. And we must advocate for our children and our culture in the classrooms and demand that the teaching of Black history matters. Our heroes cannot be footnotes in the history books. And if a race has no history, if it has no traditions that are respected and taught to the young people, it becomes a negligible factor in the thought of the world and thus in danger of being exterminated. It is so important that Black children, white children, and all children know that Black history matters, because Black history is American history, just as you said when we started, Licy. I really worry about what's happening in with the teaching of Black history, what's happening in Texas of taking DE&I out of consideration in hiring, when we know that Black children who are taught by Black teachers often get advantages that they didn't before, such as being in AP classes, being encouraged to go to prestigious universities, as opposed to being told, no, that's a stretch university for you. And that has implications, I believe, for companies down the line, because if companies are focused on DE&I, improving representation, improving the pipeline, but suddenly you have kids coming out of colleges who are not getting those advantages because they didn't have teachers who looked like them, we are creating a significant problem for our society down the line. And let's remember that we are moving to a minority white culture. And what is all of this going to mean for us? And I agree with what Maya said as far as this younger generation, that people are afraid. The older folks, I guess I'm in that group, but older folks are afraid that their kids are going to hate them because they're going to learn this history in very non-traditional ways. And they're going to go to their parents and say, how could you? And you just think about that. If you're a parent of a child and your child is looking at you and saying, how could you be a part of this? What is your answer going to be?
Maya,
I just wanted to say, yeah, you saw me jumping at the
Yeah, sorry about that.
Their ultimate vision, the ultra nationalists who are perpetuating white nationalism, their ultimate vision is to actually take us back to an apartheid America. Absolutely. One where they may not be in the majority, but they certainly control all of the strings.
Mm-hmm.
You raised Charlene, corporations, and I want to take our conversation into that space now and first take a look at the large amount of giving that has happened in corporate America, as we know, before and during the issues that arose over the last couple of years, particularly since George Floyd's murder. We've seen how many companies and how much money has been poured toward these commitments. And we've also seen in the last year or so that the amount of giving has gone way down. And I took a look at a Washington Post publication recently that they did an analysis, and they looked at the gaps in which corporate America that exist in terms of the ability of corporate America to really get at remedying what really are structural and systemic problems on race. So I want to ask you your thoughts about corporate giving now going down, those commitments. It's been some time. Have they really been effective? And then I want to ask this question about, well, we've talked about policing reform. We've talked about education and equity. There are some other issues like the role of technology and race. We saw recently the study coming out of Stanford regarding the impact of audits being done on Black Americans, right? Disproportionately impacting Black Americans. And there are other issues. How much can the corporate America do to really get at these structural and systemic issues? And then what do you make of this drop in giving?
Mm-hmm. Well, corporate America exists to solve problems. That's what corporations do. So why haven't corporations solved this problem, right? We have been struggling with this problem for 400 plus years. And so while I laud companies for the giving that they have been doing, I also want to shame them for really coming down on that giving. But what I also wonder is, I love the fact that companies are willing to stroke a check to make progress, but I also want to know, what are you doing inside your corporation? Because even with companies that I'm hearing about, giving to so many organizations that are worthwhile, yet I look at their leadership teams and they still look the same. I'm still not seeing diversity. I'm still reading stories and reading studies where Black women still feel as though they are the lowest people on the totem pole. And there are studies after studies that are showing this. So, I get really frustrated when I hear about all that's being done externally, but nothing is being done internally. And for companies who are now pulling back, of course, we're all worried about inflation. We're all worried about recession. And so companies are pulling back. We're hearing about DE&I officers who are being laid off in droves. They're losing their jobs. And I really have one thing for leaders and CEOs and boards who are doing this. Shame on you. DEI is not something that you just say, hey, I'm going to do this today, and when the road gets rough, we're going to pull back on it. This is something that is truly necessary. And let's be real. When we talk about DE&I, we're not talking about numbers. We are talking about people. People who work hard, who want to do a good job, who want to be included, who want to belong. And I would love for a leader to explain to me why none of that matters, or why that deserves a budget cut over something else. We don't cut around safety, right? We don't cut around profits. We don't cut around productivity. Yet all of these companies run on people. And I can tell you again, as I mentioned, I was at the Image Awards. I've seen Black excellence up close and personal, and we are out there. And for companies who are not doing the work, shame on you, because the landscape is ripe for all of this. And again, companies, I love the fact that you're writing the checks, but let's do something. Let's do something visible. Sorry, I get on my soapbox, Licy. Sorry about that.
We know that in a time like this of economic uncertainty, inflation, that result in budget cuts and layoffs, that oftentimes, sort of like art history class or art class in public school, like when time gets tough, these courses, those subject matters tend to be cut. And in this case, we know that unfortunately DEI budgets is one of the first things to be cut, and erases many of the gains that we could argue have been made as a result of the increase in those budgets over the last couple of years. I hear Charlene saying how incredibly short-sighted this is to do just that. And I want to ask you, what does cutting these budgets and laying off these DEI leaders after hiring them in significant numbers over the last couple of years, what does that say to that employee that Charlene has talked about? And where does that leave employees of color that are told by the companies that DEI is in fact a priority? And then those leaders are laid off, and then the budgets with respect to the DEI are reduced. What is that telling them?
It tells them that DEI doesn't matter. And that it was just something to do that was in vogue after the death of George Floyd. As you well know, after that murder, companies committed to DEI initiatives at historic levels. They hired DEI officers across the country. And what happened afterwards was that there was this far right wing effort to then pull down the curtains on DEI in corporations. I don't know if you know, but conservatives in Congress, and I'm going to say Republicans in Congress, are pushing legislation to go after ESG. DEI falls under the S in ESG. ESG means environmental, social, and governance. And so under the social is diversity, equity, and inclusion. They are trying to make it a goal that public pension funds do not have to actually observe diversity, equity, inclusion, or, other goals that are related to diversity in investments and diversity of fund managers. They are trying to basically systematically pressure corporate America to give up on that commitment to DE&I. So this is highly political. And although they might say it's because of the economy, the fact of the matter is the Department of Labor actually shows that we have never entered a recession. In fact, we're still on a hiring spree in this country, despite the layoffs that we see in certain sectors like Silicon Valley. So, it's just an excuse. The fact of the matter is there's a political game going on, a political war, if you will, against diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's for the ultimate goal of what I mentioned earlier, which is to take us backwards as a society. This is the second Reconstruction. We must fight back.
Charlene,
I was just going to say, adding on to what Maya's saying, is that the fear is palpable. Right. I think what is behind all of these efforts that Maya is talking about is fear. It's flat out fear. And it makes me insane. But I'm sorry, you were going to say something, Licy.
Well, we've been talking about how over the last couple of years, many corporations put both feet on the pedal in terms of prioritizing diverse hiring at all levels. And so I want to ask you, well, how then can we ensure, especially in this uncertain economic time and times of inflation, et cetera, that both feet can remain on the pedal, that the practice be consistent and standard to hire diverse and qualified candidates, and not just become what it seems like it might start to be becoming in terms of checking the box, like it may have been in many respects prior to 2019. What can companies and other leaders and those listening to our conversation do to ensure that both feet remain on the pedal with respect to hiring, as well as maintaining these very important budgets within these companies?
Yeah, I think as employees, we have to continue to push our corporations, right? I have not worked for a company that has not said something along the lines of our assets wear shoes, right? Our assets go up in the elevator and down in the elevator, and they have a choice as to whether or not they come to work every day. Well, if that's the case, then all of us as assets, we need to keep applying the pressure to our companies and saying, yes, this matters. We are not going to move on and go on to just something else and just ride the tide. Because I truly believe that, and especially if I look at my kids today who are in the workforce, the more pressure that employees continue to push and provide in their organizations, that organizations are going to have to change because their people are going to demand it. I also think that we have to tear down, and this may be controversial, but I think we have to tear down this white male entitlement. If I hear one more time someone saying to me, well, those people are taking my jobs, right? Well, just what made it your job? What made you feel that you were entitled to that job? Why aren't you saying that those people are taking the job or a job? Or are you saying they're taking my job? And I think we've got to break down this entitlement that protects white men. And we've all seen it happen. And I do believe that we've got to continue the pressure. I hear people talk to me about diversity fatigue, and you've heard me talk about this before. Companies have diversity fatigue. Well, you know what? None of us on this call get to wake up any day and say, we've got diversity fatigue, right? We don't have that luxury. We have to continue pushing. And the people who are in power, if you want your businesses to continue to succeed, then you need to stop talking about diversity fatigue as well and say, we are going full force. And it's not enough to just get people into the pipeline and keep minorities at that lower level. We need to bring minorities into the senior ranks of these organizations. They need to be in leadership positions. And I've heard companies say, oh, well, it's our governance. We can only have 10 people on the board. Well, who changes governance? The board. So decide you're going to have 12. Make room that we can build a bigger pie. right? It doesn't have to be us versus them. There is enough for everybody to succeed.
No, I love what you said about diversity fatigue. We don't have the choice to turn it off or on. It's always on, and it's always in overdrive. And there's always, if you will, extra luggage that we're carrying into the workplace, our own and others, and that has a physical, if not mental, if not a spiritual exhaustion that comes with that. Particularly as you said earlier on, Charlene, and as Maya also knows, being the only. Right? Being the only in some of these positions carries with it a much greater weight than unless you sit in that chair, unless you've ridden that bike, if you will, and that role that you have as a person of color at that level, being the only carries its own extra costs. And so many of us in these roles completely can appreciate and understand that. Maya, I want to ask you, with all of what's happened over these last 3 years, the impact of the pandemic, the presidential election, the rise of Black Lives Matter, the Great Resignation, the Great Reshuffling in the workforce, and that's just a few of what has been happening over the last couple of years. What do you think the implications are as we look back 5, 10, even 15 from 15 years from now, looking back? What do you think, in your view, we're going to make of all of this? And are we going to be in a different place having a conversation like this 5, 10, 15 years from now? What do you think?
The only way we will be in a different place is if people like us and those on this Zoom meeting for Power to Fly and others of similar like mine across the country stand up. Otherwise, we're going to be roadkill. And what we will be looking at is basically not even having the platforms for discussion, because there are no resources available to have those discussions, because they've been successful in pushing back against these opportunities. And so with this, I'm just saying that I grew up, in pretty much a majority white context. And I've talked to a lot of people from all over this country of all different backgrounds. But one thing that's always struck me is white people who say that, they shouldn't be held responsible for what their parents or what their grandparents did or what the country did, 4 generations ago. Well, right here, right now, we have choices, and they're clear choices. We've got governors and politicians running for president and politicians at the school board level and at the state and local level who are making arguments that are seeking to restrict rights and opportunities for people of color. Are you paying attention? Most importantly, are you willing to put your vote where your mouth is?
And I want to ask you just that, in terms of, you said stand up, put your vote where your mouth is. What can those listening to this conversation do to act on stand up? I understand vote, but listening as an employee within the workplace and to our conversation today, what specifically can they do to address so many of the things that we've talked about, regardless where they are on the spectrum, if you will, of the communities of color? Because what we're talking about today is not just Black Americans, Asian Americans, and Hispanic Latino Americans, and Native Americans, and those who are also who outside of those communities, if you will, are also marginalized in rural parts of this country. What can they do? You
do not reward perpetrators. You have to see through the arguments. You have to understand that, people are using certain tactics and techniques to try to either scare you or to try to give you misinformation. You have to educate yourself. You have to understand our history and where certain people are trying to take us. If things are happening in your company, for example, that are seeking to roll back DEI opportunities, then join together with like-minded people, create affinity groups to make sure that there are organized structures within these corporations to basically tell management, no, thank you. If in your community at the school board level, they're seeking to ban and burn books by, Nobel laureates and others of diverse backgrounds, say, It's unacceptable to try to dumb down my children. I want my children to thrive. And that means that they have to be able to successfully navigate difference in this country. That means that we have to be committed. We have to show our commitment in terms of how we vote and how we behave, both in our communities and certainly in our jobs.
I invite everyone to continue to submit your questions in the chat. We're going to get to as many of them as we can. Charlene, you talked about, just to pivot a little bit in our conversation, being at the Image Awards, the NAACP Image Awards last week. And I want to ask you first and then Maya, what are the examples of excellence within the communities of color that come to mind for you and Maya when you think about celebrating all of what you said earlier before, that we're there across industry, across communities in so many ways. Who are some that come to your mind as you think about this question of celebrating people of color and their excellence?
Well, you know, and I'll tell you, when I was at the Image Awards, something that I was struck with by is that often when people think of Black excellence, they think of sports, they think of entertainment, you know, they think of those areas. And certainly those people were certainly lauded for their craft and for their excellence and for their brilliance. But what really struck me when I was there, even though there were celebrities that were being lauded and artists that were being lauded in their acceptance speeches, they were not talking about their craft. Okay, they were talking about the importance of education, the importance of giving back, of leading the way, the importance of equity for everyone, not just us, but for everyone. You know, for fighting for everyone. And I found that to be just really palpable, because it wasn't just it wasn't an environment of let's just pat ourselves on the back for these great songs and this great acting that we're doing. People were talking about making a difference in the world. You know, there was certainly Ben Crump. I mean, I think he practically brought the house down with what he was talking about. We had Serena Williams, who was acknowledged, and she didn't talk about being the best, tennis player in the world. She was talking about the importance of motivating and inspiring others and working hard and taking our excellence into other places. Gabrielle Union and Dwayne Wade talked about their foundation and the importance for us, again, to seek equity for everyone. And I thought this was really palpable. And something else I noticed when I was there is that, the Image Awards, it's the NAACP Image Awards, but it doesn't mean that it's only attended by Black people, right? There were all kinds of people and all kinds of hues, and everybody was welcoming. There was no talk about cultural appropriation. There was, it was just, let's welcome, let's work together for the sake of rising everybody. And to me, that is the best kind of Black excellence. And I will say also, before I get off of this topic, being in a room with that many Black people who were at the top of their game for so many different reasons was the first time in my life that I've been in a room where I didn't have to count to see how many Black people were there enough to make me comfortable. I didn't feel like I had anything to prove, and I felt like I belonged. And you know what? I want everybody who looks like me, everybody who is a person of color or who are in underrepresented groups to feel that way every single day in the environments that they walk into, because we deserve it. We all deserve to feel that way.
Maya, I was struck by an interview I heard yesterday from Ke Huy Quan. He is the actor in the probably what may win the Oscars here for Best Movie, Everything Everywhere All at Once. Many of us know him from his days in playing in Indiana Jones as the young kid alongside Harrison Ford. But he talked about how getting a chance to be seen was to him, how important it was in this film. And he broke down in his comments that after all of these years, Daniel Kwan, the director, gave him the opportunity to be seen and heard. And it makes me think about just how important the power of being seen and acknowledged is, and the excellence that exists certainly in this movie with Michelle Yeoh and other distinguished actors. But I think in so many ways, as I heard that, we could all really appreciate what Kwan had said. I just thankful that someone helped me to be seen. And he's been in movies for a long, long time. I'm just curious how your thoughts and reactions to that.
I think that it's powerful because belonging matters, and it goes to the heart of the matter too. And so when we're talking about this whole notion of DEI, it's not just for diversity, equity, and inclusion's sake, it's to foster belonging and performance and connection and unity. And so with that, we're talking about a vision of our society, of our companies, where we take the best of that everyone has to offer. And then that, as a result, ends up being to the best benefit of everyone, lo and behold. And so with that, Charlene mentioned the Image Awards. I just want to hold up. I want to answer that question that you asked. My late husband, Elijah Cummings, wrote a book, We're Better Than This, and it received the 2021 Image Award for, I'm forgetting the category. But it was during the height of the pandemic. And so it was virtual, Charlene. I didn't get to go in person to accept the award on his behalf. But I want to, Licy, if you don't mind, I want to give you the example of Dr. Ruth Simmons.
Yes.
Dr. Ruth Simmons is the first ever African-American woman to lead an Ivy League university. She was the president of Brown University. She was also the president of Smith College. After that distinguished career where she did very well at both of these presidencies and went on to serve on boards like Goldman Sachs and other very major Fortune 500 corporations, she retired and went home. Her home was Houston, Texas, where she promptly on the cocktail circuit was offered a job as president of Prairie View A&M University, which is my alma mater, an HBCU outside of Houston, Texas. She did phenomenally. She got a $50 million contribution from, a very wealthy philanthropist. She, increased the endowment by 40%. But she also invited the first ever activist in residence, who was a Black Lives Matter founder. She also created the Center for Justice and Race at Prairie View and created African American Studies courses at Prairie View. Do you think that she was celebrated by the Texas A&M system? No, she was not. In fact, this hammer that we're hearing from Texas right now with regards to getting rid of diversity, equity, inclusion, not only in state hiring, but also in the university systems, is directly as a result of her excellence. So this is the question. And by the way, they're right now, these university system people are going through the curriculum to find out where they can strike race, where they can strike diversity, where they can strike things that they feel Black students should not learn. She prematurely resigned because of the lack of cooperation and the pressure and the disrespect that she received from the Texas A&M system. And unfortunately, the person that they're bringing in as her replacement does not have the qualifications that she had. So here is a woman who is excellent on every level, ran a university in 4 years with accomplishments that are unheard of, and yet was not celebrated and was run out essentially of her job because they didn't want excellence. They wanted subservience.
We have just about 4 minutes left in our conversation here. So I want to ask both of you this concluding question. Charlene, with you, and we'll be really quick here. For all of those who have been listening to this conversation over the last almost hour, what is the one piece of advice taken from this conversation that you want to make sure that they've heard from you?
Do something. We all need to do something. If we don't, using Maya's words, if we don't vote, if we don't engage, we just let this happen on our watch. And we can't do that. There is far, far too much at stake. So for those of you who are listening to this, understand just how important, how dire this is, that laws are being put in place to take us back. There is a pushback against progress, and we need to make sure that it stops. And Maya, I just have to tell you, I feel like I just went to church, so thank you.
Well, I certainly have gotten a lot from your comments, Charlene. You are so magnificent. So thank you for sharing your perspective, and all that you have done is magnificent. But I just want to say this, back to the people who say, you know, why should I pay reparations because, you know, someone 4 generations ago did something. The fact of the matter is that this is not an argument for reparations, but it's an argument for responsibility. We see all of these decisions being made all around us. If you choose to put your head in the sand and act like there aren't consequences for the direction of our country, then you are complicit in terms of the rollback. And so I am asking you to take your head out of the sand, understand what the game is being played, understand why the war is being launched, and decide to stand and decide to fight and decide to fight for our future, the future of this country, our democracy, and diversity that celebrates everyone. Thank you.
Amen to you both. And for a terrific kitchen table conversation that we had once again with Charlene Wheeless and Dr. Maya Cummings, Rockeymoore. I will share something in closing that if you don't know who Belva Davis is, you should. Belva Davis is a pioneer in radio journalism that inspired the likes of Oprah Winfrey and so many others. She is the first African-American woman to become a television reporter on the West Coast, has won a number of Emmy Awards. And something that I recently learned that she said struck me, which I want to share with all of you, which is, do not be afraid of the space between your dreams and reality. And to live in that space and to believe in your dreams and believe that it can become a reality. And so I want to thank you together with Maya and Charlene for a terrific hour, which we hope has been impactful, has illuminated where we are, where we've been, how much farther we need to go in this question of racial equity in 2023. And so with that, Hunter, I want to turn it back to you, and I want to thank Power to Fly, Catherine Zaleski, all of the great leaders around the table there for giving us the opportunity to talk with you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.